All right, we'll get started in about a minute. Thanks. All right, I think getting ready to go. Jared or Ryan, I don't know who can start the recording, but let's start at 2 after.
Gotcha.
All right, it's 2 after. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Are we recording?
We are. We're good to go.
All right, thanks. Hey, my name is Dave Thomas. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Bales, and I want to welcome you to today's Informational Friday presentation. Today's topic is A Beginner's Guide to IPAs Part 2. Part 1 was so fantastic. I've been waiting for Part 2 like it's the next Marvel movie, so I'm really excited to see what is in store for us over the next 45 minutes. But before we get started, and if you're not familiar with Bales, I'd like to take a second and tell you a little bit about us. Next slide. We've been in the Infor ecosystem for over 26 years. We're entirely Infor focused, and we do nothing but Infor implementations, upgrades, and managed services. We support all aspects of the technology, including S3, Landmark, and Cloud Suite, including the HCM, finance, and supply chain modules. Suites. In fact, we have been recognized and given partnering awards in 8 out of the last 10 years. Bales is also one of the only women-owned businesses supporting the Infor S3 and Landmark products, and our consultants bring 15 plus years of experience in the space with the equivalent of professional services. Some were former benefits managers, compensation managers, directors of supply chain, as well as former controllers and CFOs. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and let me introduce your presenters. Robert Schmidt and Jared Brock. Take it away, guys. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name's Jared Brock. I'm a technical practice manager here at Bales, and I've got Robert Schmidt here with me. He's a principal technical consultant. And today is part 2 of A Beginner's Guide to IPA. If you tuned in to part 1, our webinar last time, you know that we kind of did a high-level overview of what IPA is and how it fits into the larger Infor ecosystem, and particularly the Landmark and Lawson environments and application modules that bolt into those. And the feedback from that really told us that people wanted a deeper dive into some of the more complex parts of IPA. So we thought the obvious choice for that next step is the Landmark transaction node. When we think of IPA as a business logic or a business workflow engine, which is really what it's designed to be, the Landmark transaction node is what does all the heavy lifting there. It's how we interact with the Landmark environment and how we interact with the applications that bolt into Landmark, like GHR and FSM. We're also going to talk a little bit about variables and just how the concept of variables, like development at large, really help us build more complexity into some of the activities in these workflows. and leverage some of the functionality that's in other parts of the system. So today we're going to talk about variables. We're going to talk about the landmark transaction node. We're going to talk about what some of those processing models look like for the transaction node, and then what it looks like to actually build an LPL transaction string with that transaction node. And then we're going to show some examples of kind of how that processes and what it looks like to step through some of that. On this little example here, you can see, I meant to call this out earlier actually, how important variables are and where they fit into an example of a flow. I think a lot of times it's easy for us to just assume that because variables are part of development all over the place, not specific to process flow, we don't need to pay a ton of attention to them. But you can see in this example, they play a huge part. Variables are what's carrying the data across from node to node, and what's translating and massaging the data to get it to look like and act like what we need it to do. So they play a big part. And again, so do those transaction nodes. To get a flow to do something that we really wanted to do from a workflow perspective or a business logic perspective in the landmark environment, like I said, we're leaning heavily on those landmark transaction nodes. So I'm going to start with what are variables. I know a lot of you, especially if you are a developer or have had exposure there, none of this is going to be new to you, but there are some particular concepts we want to hit from the IPA perspective and how variables act there and kind of how Infor refers to them in the context of IPA. So we've got 4 kinds of variables that we use in IPA: global, process, activity, and return. And to some extent, these are a little bit self-explanatory, but it does get a little bit muddy in IPA, so we want to spend a little bit of time to clarify that. So a global variable is something that exists at the environment level. And when I say environment, I mean that landmark runtime layer where all those other applications like GHR and FSM and Global Financial Controller, where those things bolt into. So the environment exists above all those applications. And so it's, any variable that exists there truly is global in the sense that it's the same between GHR and FSM. So those things are at the environment level, and we can pull those environment variables down into the process flow engine and into an IPA flow. Next are process variables. These are variables specific to the actual process that we're working with. These can be instantiated. That's what we call it when we create a variable, when we pull a variable into being for the purpose of running a process. They can be instantiated at the start node. That's the very beginning of your process flow. Or they can be instantiated later on. You don't have to start the flow with all the variables that you need from a process perspective. You can create some of those as you go down the line. And process variables are available only within the specific process that you're running. So if you've got a couple different process flows and you have a bunch of variables defined in one of those processes, they're not available to the other. Even if they're running in the same application, they're running in the same environment, those process variables are specific just to the process that you're running through. Next, we have activity variables. And these are variables that come sort of delivered with the activity nodes, the different types of activity nodes that you're using. And they're going to be different depending on what that activity node is and the type of data that activity node is working with. So for the purposes of this discussion, if we're talking about something like the landmark transaction node, you're going to have activity variables related to the kind of data that you're pulling back for the specific transaction that you're doing in that node. Same case with something like a real simple activity node like the email node. You've got a couple variables that are specific to that email node that tell it who you're going to send the email to, who the email's from, what the subject line looks like, that kind of thing. And then we have return variables. We don't use these quite as much, but they do play a really important part. They send back some key information from a triggering process or a parent process that had kicked off that query or transaction. So a good example of this is something like a web services activity where you make a web service call and you get some kind of return code back specific to that call. That's where return variables would come into play. We've got a couple common variable definitions here. These are, again, going to be very familiar to you if you've got any exposure in the kind of developer world. These are common across basically all development platforms, and these really can be thought of just as data types. One of the most common ones we use in Landmark is the string. This is I was going to say this is just what it sounds like, but recognize that I come from the developer world, so it makes a lot of sense to me. But if you don't come from that world, a string is not really self-explanatory. But a string is just a string of characters. It's just letters, numbers, free form, but it's a string of characters, and a lot of times in something like Landmark, that encapsulates something like the employee name, but it could also encapsulate something like an encryption key or an algorithm key or something like that. So a string is really can be very versatile. Boolean is pretty simple. It's true or false. So we use that to just capture a really simple kind of binary response to something, true or false. Date, this one is pretty self-explanatory, but this is important for those folks who are coming from Lawson S3 or maybe have a hybrid environment or a federated environment with Lawson S3 and Landmark, because Lawson S3 and Landmark conceptualize dates very differently. The date format is very different. And in Lawson S3, there's a particular date format that Lawson keeps all of its dates in. But in Landmark uses a Java date format, which contains a lot more information. So if you've got an environment where you're passing data back and forth, this one's going to be real important because there's going to be a lot of translation of those date types. Next is integer. This is pretty straightforward. This is just a whole number, nice and easy. Then last but not least, we've got double, long, and these are just more complex number values. So something like a dollar amount or a pay rate, something where we've got some decimal points and not quite a whole complete number.
And Jared, just to call out on the dates, I think it's just helpful to know that, you can interact with the date, but you can also change it. There's some good functions built within the system itself that allows you to do like an AGS call that allows you to format it in the appropriate and allows you to format the date that you need it in the appropriate format. So when you're interacting with a date field in and of itself within the Landmark environment, make sure that you're looking at the appropriate format so that when you put your date string kind of together, you're going to match the format that your variable is to the actual data in and of itself. So,
yeah, that's a good point. That was one of the most frustrating things when I personally first started dealing with Lawson S3 data and Landmark. You're right. IPA does come delivered with a bunch of these Java functions that will convert dates to however you need to move them. But I was so used to the S3 date format that I was trying to compare things in GHR. Nothing would ever match up on date. Cue 10 minutes of me banging my head against the desk. There we go, the functions to convert the date. So there is a lot of that, but IPA has those tools built in. So it's just a matter of kind of paying attention to what those different data types are that you're dealing with, and converting them and translating them as needed. And another good example of that is that there are some things, some very similar data fields, like for instance related to the employee, that in Lawson S3 are an integer data type, but in Landmark for whatever reason are a string, or vice versa. And because these are different data types, you can't compare them without first converting them so that you're really doing an apples to apples comparison. So there are some of those gotchas when you're dealing with different types of environment and applications, but all those tools for converting that are built into IPA. It's just a matter of knowing when you're going to need to convert.
And when we'll be looking at later in the Landmark transaction node, kind of pulling a data in, as you're working with different modules, and we're going to talk some about accessibility, as you're working with kind of the different areas of Landmark being Cloud Suite Financials or HCM, or even like going into like benefits or any of those secondary, or not secondary, but the other kind of areas within Infor, pay attention to those dates, because I have found in some of the work I've done where I can get a date from one place and then I need to transform that or make it look different when I'm going to somewhere else. Or even when I'm writing a file out, or if I'm trying to give information to someone else or some other system, that date may need to be transformed and it may need to be massaged or done something with in order to make it more usability use for another system or another person. So just be aware of that.
Yeah. So what is the landmark transaction node? So we kind of broke this out into what we think are the most important conceptual parts of this particular activity node. And remember, we're talking about one specific type of activity node. When we did our part one, we kind of did a high level overview of what a bunch of those activity nodes were. And remember that there's something like 24 maybe by now. But we're talking about one in particular, and that's the landmark transaction node. And so when we think about the way this node works and what are the components, we think about kind of 4 different key concepts. The main one is just querying and transacting, meaning it's a way for us to go in and query data from the landmark environment and from the applications that are bolted in there. But it's also a way for us to transact that data. So meaning make some kind of update or initiate some kind of thing, some kind of action to happen against some particular data set.
Jared, I'm sorry. A question came in regarding dates before you got too ahead, and I'm sorry I missed it. Is the date in the day, month, century, year, or month, day, century, year?
Well,
most of the
no, go ahead, Robert.
I was going to say most of the landmark fields, especially on the HCM side that you're going to be interacting with, are for a 4-year, 2-month, 2-day format. So if you're getting data in, or if you're getting information, from another system, then you'll have to transform that to match. But you'll see what those look like, and we'll have a good way of looking at that. And then, Kelly, that would be without the slashes, generally speaking. But if I recall correctly, we have a screenshot where that actually shows it coming from the system. So we can definitely call that out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Definitely.
So good question. Next, let's talk about landmark accessibility. So this is our idea of how powerful this transaction node is because of all the different things that you can do with it in landmark. The landmark transaction node really gives us full access to what's in the business class. And if you're not really familiar with a business class in landmark, you can think of it sort of like a data table. So if we take something like the employee data table, I think most of us, even if we're not on the technical side, understand that there's a bunch of data and a bunch of ways to store that data in a database that are related to just that employee record. And the idea of the business class and landmark takes that another step further. And there is all of that data and all those records stored in a database, just the way you'd expect, related to some kind of object like an employee. But there's also a bunch of application code and a bunch of different actions that can happen and can be initiated inside that business class. And so if we're talking about something like an employee, a good example of that is that in that employee business class, along with all of the employee data that you might have, there are actions like hire an employee, rehire an employee, terminate an employee, change an employee's name, things like that. And so through this landmark transaction node, we also have access to all of those different pieces of code that are packaged along with business classes. And of course, that continues through as things get patched and new functionality comes out. Anything that's in or gets added to those business classes from a programming perspective or a workflow perspective, we've got access to that through the landmark transaction node. So it really is much more powerful than simply querying data down or uploading data back up. We've got the ability to utilize all that functionality in between.
And to just real quick, Jared, just to take that even a step further. So even when we're talking about config console, right? Some of the stuff we talked about is creating our own business classes, creating our own fields, duplicating an action and making it our own. Those are even accessible as well. So when we talk about accessibility, it's really talking about the ability to go in and hit all of those different areas within Landmarks. So, getting into work units and PFI and getting into, all of that, that is all accessible via that. So we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into that. So.
Yep. Good point. Then, of course, there's iterating. Iterating is the idea that we run through a set of steps, a set of predefined steps for each record that we want to process, or each little field in a record that we want to process. And the landmark transaction node by design is an iterative node. And so a lot of times we use this to do a single record query. We just want to find an employee's name based on their employee ID or something like that. Well, that's easy and straightforward, but we can also use that node to run through a bunch of different processing steps for a bigger subset of records that we query out. So we really take the power and the flexibility of that node to the next level when we use it in an iterative scenario. And we'll see that as we go through some of those examples. And then kind of combining all that together, we get this idea that we can nest and we can cascade a bunch of these landmark transaction nodes to really make a very powerful workflow by combining all of these things together. And again, some of the examples we'll go through really make that clear. But that's where we get a lot of the, a lot of the streamlining and optimization and performance benefits and real value out of something like IPA is when we start combining and really pushing some of these aspects of the landmark transaction node out a little bit. That's where we get that power, and we'll see that.
And then, so just kind of taking those 4 areas and kind of going a bit deeper dive into, really what we're talking about. So, looking at the first one here, we're talking really more about querying. So we're taking a kind of simplistic approach to saying, I'm going to start my process and I'm going to then, in that variable, I'm going to assign some variables. That way I've been passed in some information and I want to make sure I can control that within my process. Because I want to make sure that I know that it's being assigned and massaged and done with what I need. So we move into, querying and getting a data set, right? This is really just, I get some information, I'm pulling a set of data out via my landmark transaction node because I have accessibility to get in and see like my employee or my resource business class. And then from there, I want to build out. I want that information is going to come to me and I want to make sure that I have it in the appropriate order, or if I need to have certain information being pulled from that and I only want a subset of that, I'm going to then use my message builder to kind of build that into a string that I want, and then I'm going to FTP it off. So it's a real simplistic kind of look at to say, I'm getting some information, I'm putting it together, and I'm sending it off to someone else. So I'm querying data from the system. I'm not really doing anything with it. I'm not updating it. I'm just getting that information. And then we move into transacting. So this looks very similar, right? Because we're still using the same node, the same landmark transaction node. I'm going to start my process. I'm going to control my variables. So I'm going to assign those out. But now instead of getting data, I don't need to actually get anything. I need to tell the system that this is now, let's say, their new email address, or this is now their new phone number. If I need to update, a part of a work unit, if I need to do any of that, I'm now updating the system. And generally when we update, we want to make sure that everything happens okay. So we're going to come back and get what Jared was talking about is any of our activity nodes have those delivered variables coming back from that. So here I'm going to update, I'm going to create a message of what happened. When I updated the system, it spit a message out saying that it was either successful or there were issues or that everything's okay. So I'm going to put that into, a message, and then I'm going to send off to someone else and let them know, hey, this update was successful, or hey, we tried to make this update and it wasn't. So really taking a kind of simplistic view to say I'm using the same landmark transaction node, but I'm able to do 2 very different functions and kind of piece areas around that. So going on to the next, go ahead.
Even though this is a really simple flow, and I was Robert, as you were explaining, I was trying to think of good real world use cases for something this simple that we'd actually put into a workflow. But maybe say it's something like all of our employees are moving to a new office, and so we need to update the work location for all of the employees all at once because everybody's going to move to this new office. And if we take that as an example, and we're going to go through an update, I think it's a good spot to say, okay, let's look at what would those variables look like. So, maybe we're using this assign variable node to say, here's the new address, or here's the new floor of the office building or something like that. And then we're going to update all the employees with that. But then, just like you were saying, there's going to be some variables that come out of that. And we can capture that in a message builder. And then one of those, and this goes back to the different types of variables that we were talking about, one of those activity variables, and remember that they're a little bit different depending on what type of activity node we're talking about. But one of those activity variables for something like the message builder is a message. I mean, it's a variable, we can call it whatever we want, but it's a message variable. And in this case, we can capture that message variable in an email and send that out. And so in this case, it could be, X number of employees got updated correctly, 5 employees didn't, something like that, and send that email out. And so that's a good example of how, sure, we can do all this cool stuff with the landmark transaction node, but if we want to capture any of those results, or if we want to really increase the flexibility in how we feed that transaction node the data it needs to work, that's where those variables come in. And that's why we couldn't really talk about landmark transaction without at least bringing in this concept of variables and how the different kinds kind of play together.
Excellent point. Thanks, Jared. So we wanted to kind of talk in and really get into some accessibility, and we're going to get a bit more into kind of the screen that we're looking at here a little bit in the presentation, and knowing that. So really, accessibility is the idea that I can go in and pull information, I can update information, I can transact with Landmark in and of itself. And how I get to that, or where I get to, is all driven from how I'm building my LPL string. So we choose our data area. So we're looking here at our first kind of drop down. And in our case, we're going to look towards the HCM data area because I want to look at, let's say, employee information. So I have access to, Jen or in your Class 2 financials, but here we're going to look at HCM. And then when we go to kind of our next drop down, all of this cascades or waterfalls. So depending on what data area I get a subset of modules, and my modules can, for people who are familiar with that, I'll kind of think of it as like system codes. They're way more expansive than that, but it's kind of an idea of how to look at it. It's a categorization of kind of what those business classes are. So we have highlighted here HR because I want to look towards employee information. But if I wanted to get some of my configurations, I need to go to a different module. If I need to go into getting some information on my work units, I need to go into PFI. So each of the areas that are in there are going to be broken into the modules. And that's really kind of getting into the accessibility, is I can choose which module I want to look in. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and select HR, and then that cascades down to my objects. So these are all, in essence, my business classes that fall within my module. And I can, even when we talk about just employees, so I have employees, I have their bank details, I have, their contact information, I have their addresses, all of the different business classes that are built within the modules then fall within the list and allows us the ability to go grab that business class. So like employee is one of the biggest ones we use. I can then select employee and then determine what action do I want. So one of the things we talked about is that there's all these kind of different actions tied to the business class. So Jared gave an example of if I want to hire a resource, if I want to rehire a resource, if I want to change a name of a resource. All of these actions tie to my employee in and of itself, and they are directly built within the application. And I can even access actions that I create. We've done this in the past where someone doesn't necessarily like the hire resource the way it comes out of the box. So we have to change that process in order to do different things. And now that I have a different hire resource process, I can grab that built within the system in and of itself via an IPA and then go through and process the way that I needed to. So here we're going to, the other one I want to call out is our find. So the one nice thing that I want to call out here is the fact that the find is the very last on every action list, is the very last action to get. So when we talk about querying data, that's my ability to find information. And it is nice that on every list we look at, it's the very last one. So we didn't have a screenshot, but I definitely did want to call that out. And then I'm going to kind of go over operator a little bit. It's not used nearly as much, but the action type is. So we have 4 main action types. 3, I say, in my mind, are used quite a bit. So we have a create, update, delete. So anytime I'm interacting with the system and doing anything other than pulling some information, I'm going to use the action type of create, update, delete. And then when I am pulling information, I may very well be expecting only a single record. And if I know for sure that I will always only get a single record, then your best bet is to go ahead and put a single record query. Any other instance where I may get multiple records, or I know I'm getting multiple records, you're definitely going to want a multi-record query. One of the catch-alls that I have found over the years of working is if I even have a minute thought that I might get more than one, use a multi-record query, because the system will actually throw an error on the landmark transaction node. And if you don't handle it, then you could run into issues where your work units may be failing, or you may have some, long-time, errors that you're going to have to deal with. So use single record query really when you know 100% that you're going to only get that one record, and then you can handle the others as needed. So, and then we're going to get into kind of more along key fields, non-key fields, and those a little bit later. But this is in essence what we're talking about, accessibility. So when you drop in your landmark transaction node and you go in to start defining what is it that you want to pull, what information is that, you drive what that looks like. I can go into different data areas or different modules or different objects within the modules, and then even change my actions. So I can choose all of those, even custom ones that are built within the system. And that really shows some of the powerfulness of the landmark transaction node.
Yeah, and I think it's worth talking about that find again, because when I remember when I was first exposed to IPA and kind of this new model for transacting data and landmark, it took me a while to even figure out how I'm supposed to just query data, because in old Lawson S3, that's really straightforward because the data model is really straightforward. I just basically have a query node. I just plug in the table that I want to pull it from, and I plug in the fields that I want, and voila. But because this new data model in Landmark is so much different, there's so much more going on conceptually. And so even though this form looks really powerful, there's obviously a lot of fields here. You can see from these drop-down menus the size of the scroll bar. There's thousands and thousands of options. And if you're familiar at all with the business classes, you know that there's thousands of business classes. So there's a lot to choose from here. And sometimes it sort of feels like the straightforward thing is a little bit buried in there, right? Because to go, literally to get the find, if all you want to do is do a query, finds all the way at the bottom, which feels like some kind of allegory for something, trying to find what we need in here. But that's how that data model really introduces a lot of flexibility and power in here. And it's also where I think Robert and I start sounding a little bit like Apple iPhone fanboys here when we talk about this, because when you couple this data model with the business classes and the kind of programmatic code that can be in business classes and the kinds of actions there, with our ability now to customize all of that in a standardized, supported way through something like Configuration Console, that represents a ton of power for us as end users, without doing a lot of deep system modification under the hood. So a lot of the things that back in Lawson S3, we would have had to go through and make some environment customizations and really change how some of the system worked under the hood. Here, we can do a lot of that through essentially customized business logic that is built in and supported by Infor. So when we combine this with some of the other tools that are now being more widely adopted, like Configuration Console, we really get a lot closer to what people like Robert and I, from a development perspective and from a system implementation and architect perspective, kind of saw as the landmark GHR FSM, the promised land of what if we could actually get all this functionality that we're talking about here put together and working, it would be really cool. And we hear that all the time with a lot of different products, but now we're actually seeing a lot of those things really come together in a really well done, generally available, out there for full release, wide release. All that stuff is working now, and we can see that stuff layering on top of each other to really make some really powerful tools that are relatively easy to use once we actually kind of understand how these pieces fit together. So it's really cool. It's a cool time to be looking at some of this stuff.
I get asked this quite a bit, so we thought we'd take just a couple minutes. The landmark transaction node, to what Jared talked about earlier, was that it is an iterative loop. So it is built in and of itself a looping process. So we have to account for that. And sometimes the loop, when we talked about a simple query, is just getting the one record that we need. It's getting some information based on that, and that's all it does. And then it finishes the loop and goes on. But more often than not, we're actually transacting and doing other things when we want to get that information. So kind of talking through just, generally, the landmark transaction node is going to pull a set of records based off of our page size, which we're going to talk about here shortly. And at this point in time, I can define what my page size is. So it's going to get, in our case, the default is 30. I'm going to get a record set of at least up to the number of records that I've identified, but a max of 30 records. And then once I have my initial set of data, which in our example here is up to 30 records, for each individual record, I am then going to process through the steps. So record 1 of 30 is going to go through step 1, step 2, and step 3. And then it's going to ask, am I done with my initial set of records? No. I'm going to then grab record 2, and I'm going to go through step 1, step 2, step 3, and I'm going to check, am I done with my record set? No. And I'm going to do that up through the amount of records I have. In our example here, we have 30 records, so it would do that 30 times. So when we look the initial flow that Jared had on the agenda, and we're going to look deeper into that here in a little bit, I have a lot of stuff that happens in between that looping process. So I want to account for that within my process to know that I'm going to go grab a set of records, I'm going to process through each of those steps for each record, and then I'm going to go and ask a question, do I have more records? If I have more records, being end of record no, I'm going to go back and grab more. And I'm going to keep doing that in an iterative process based off of a page size of how many records I want, and go through each of my until I am done finding records. And even back to our simplistic one, that could be one record. It could be an update to a single employee. It could be getting a piece of information for a single employee, but it could also be doing that and getting information for an entire department or for one enterprise group. If I can identify who that group of people are, and I want to process through and do something or look at something for all of those people, we wanted to really call out and kind of talk about what that iterative process really is. And then kind of moving into, we're the high level of saying, we looked earlier at simplistic processes, right? I wanted to get a piece of information and then end, and I wanted to update a piece of information and then end. This is moving more towards our multi-step processing. So I am going to start here at the beginning, and similarly before, where I wanted to control my variables, I'm going to assign out those variables. I know in this instance that I'm going through and I'm getting quite a bit of information. So let's say I want to update emails for an entire department. I know that department is changing, so I need to go get that entire department's information. So at this stage, I'm going to go get that 30 records. So if I have 500 people in my department, I'm going to get that initial 30 records. I want to control information regarding the coming out of that. So a good practice for of working with variables is after an activity node, go ahead and assign those variables as needed in order for you to work with them. So I'm going to then go into my assign variables and assign out what it is that I need. Because then when I move into my branch is really my if, else, if, right? So it's my case, it's my if, else, if that allows me the ability to go one way or another. So here I'm going to use my variables and I'm going to check on a variable to say, hey, do I need to go update a record or do I need to go check some additional information about a record? So it's one path or the other. So even though I have both paths on here, when I process my single record in our example here is going to go one way or the other. It's not going to go both. So yes, I have in essence 6 nodes for processing purposes, but each record isn't going to hit all 6 of those. It's going to hit the path that I'm moving it down based off my branch node. So here again, if I go up to my update, let's say instance I need to update an email for that person, I move to my top half where I'm updating. I'm using the same landmark transaction node, similar to what we saw earlier, and I'm going to go update that person's email address. I'm going to hit the right module, the right business class, and I'm going to use the appropriate action in order for me to touch and update the email address for that person. And then it's a good practice when I update it, I want to get some sort of response. I want to know that that was successful, or I want to know that there was an error. I'm then again doing some variable, manipulation. I'm putting the variables, controlling them the way that I want them to be controlled. That way I know it's going to process the same. And then similar to what we talked about in the iterative process, I'm going to come back to my end and say, do I have more records? Is there more work that needs to be done? Yes, I had 500 people. That was only record 1. Circles back around. I have my 30 records, and I'm going to assign. I'm going to go to my branch. Maybe in this case, I don't do an update right away. Maybe I need to do the check. So then it kicks me down to my second half of my branch where I'm going to assign some variables. I'm going to go check the information that's there, do some more assigning. I'm going to go to my end. And I'm going to keep looping through that depending on which path I need to take until I've gotten through my first 30 records. Then once it finishes the 30, it grabs 31 through 60. I'm going to do it all over again until I get to my 500 employees that fall within my department. It will keep processing that loop until it gets all the way through it. Once I've gotten to the end of my 500 employees, right, my department had 500, I'm done doing something with those employees, either updating them or checking them. Now I'm going into kind of a end process, positioning where now I want to know, did my work unit have any errors? So I've handled if I had an error via an update, but my work unit in and of itself may have had an issue. Something may have thrown an error to the work unit. So I'm doing another branch here. Hey, do I have errors? Yes or no? Because if I don't have errors, then I'm good to go. I mean, we're golden. We can continue on with our process. But if I did have errors, it's probably a good idea if we go get that information. I'm using the same landmark transaction node, and I'm going to go out to my work unit, and I'm going to pull the errors from the work unit that I'm processing all of this under, because it's a built-in variable within my process. I know exactly where this was processing and which work unit was there. So I can get the errors from that work unit. I can collect it, put it into a nice, neat package, and then I can do my emails. So I'm either going to email an admin to say, hey, I processed this. I ended up with 5 errors of the 500. Someone needs to go check on these. Or I'm emailing my initiator. I'm telling them, hey, we updated all 500 people. Either they needed to be updated or there was no update, but everything is golden. So I reached this kind of larger multi-step processing where I'm going out. I'm using a lot of the same nodes, but I'm doing a lot of different things. And even in of itself, this is a pretty simple process. So we start building bigger and bigger in order to handle all of the different use cases that fall within our process, but we have to start somewhere. So we start in one piece and then we start adding on to get to our full engulfed process that fulfills all of our use cases.
Yeah, and that is a good point, Robert. For those of you who are pretty familiar with IPA or looking at some flows, maybe developing, maybe maintaining, you know that once the flow gets much more complex than this, it no longer fits on a PowerPoint slide anymore. For a lot of us, it no longer fits on our monitors. So yeah, even though this is a little bit more complex, and we are including a couple different use cases here, this is still the very tip of the iceberg when we talk about how much complexity and how many steps we can add into a process flow. And I think it's worth kind of zooming out again and really looking at this and seeing how this example, even though it is pretty simple, does combine a lot of the different things we've talked about, right? Because we've got a query, a pretty easy query, just pulling in some subset of data based on criteria. But then we've got a couple different updates or a couple different, this is another query, but done in a slightly different way for a different purpose. And these three are all looking at application data, but then we've got this one looking at environment data. And again, going back to variables, you can see we've got a bunch of different variables at play here and a lot of those different types. For all these message builders, we're using different activities. For all these queries and all these transaction nodes, we're using activity variables coming out of them. We're doing a lot of different assigns, obviously. And we're also in the work unit query going back to global variables, going back to environment level variables, looking for things like the work unit that are consistent across the applications. So we're really kind of using a lot of those different things we've talked about, even though this is still a pretty simple procedure. So, we've walked through kind of what an example looks like, but let's look at what it actually takes to build some of those transaction nodes using the activity properties that are on the canvas for IPD, the Infor Process Designer. We don't have a screenshot of the process designer, but if you remember from part one, we kind of walked through what that looked like and where the activity nodes fit onto the screen, and then how within each of those activity nodes, there's some properties that help you kind of determine what that node is going to do. This one, again, is sort of deceptively simple at first because there's not a lot of information here on this properties pane. There's the configuration information here, and this deals with configuration sets. And we are not going to talk about configuration steps or configuration sets that much here, but we do plan on talking through some of that in kind of the next episode of this. So stay tuned for that. There's a lot of good information that goes into configuration sets and a lot of extra flexibility that we can get from utilizing those in a really thoughtful way. But for the purposes of this example, let's just think of configuration sets as a way to tell IPA how it needs to talk to the applications that it's trying to talk to. In this case, maybe Landmark, maybe Lawson, things like that. It kind of gives us a basic set of variables and parameters that we can work with to interact with the application. So then we've got the build button and the import button on this Landmark transaction string. That build button gets us to the transaction string builder, which we've shown a couple screenshots of before and kind of walked through. That lets us get at all the different accessibility options in Landmark that we talked about. But we can also use the import function to basically just drop a string in there, maybe that we're pulling from another process flow or we're pulling from another developer. And it lets us just drop it in. And then we've got this kind of editing window, and we'll talk a little bit about that once we go through these middle steps. It'll make a little bit more sense.
So earlier we kind of took a little bit of, when we talked about accessibility, we started looking into this. You'll notice this looks a little bit different than last time. So, we start up at the top, as we said before, or as I said before, this is cascading or waterfalling. So we're going to select our data area here. We're going to go into HCM. We then go into our module. In this case, we're going to go to HR and pull some, employee-related information. So I just want the base employee. I don't want any of the kind of the add-ons to the employee. So we've selected employee. In this case, you will see the find, right? I said at the end of the action list is always find. So this case, we went down, we grabbed find. Action operator, it's actually going to be dependent on the actions. So if the action that you're dealing with does have an operator tied to it, you then select it from here. Generally, in my experience, I don't know about others, but in my experience, this is generally none. I haven't dealt with a whole lot of actions where I need the operator tied to it. And then in the next one, our action type, we talked about single, we talked about multiple. In our case, I know I want multiple records, so I'm going to do my multiple record query. You did see previously in the screenshot where this did have a relation query. So that kind of ties in to the next box of relation. If I select a relation query, this would then allow me to select another business class that is then related to the business class that I'm in. So if I have one and I want to get to another one, that's how I connect from one to another. I use my related query, and then I use my relation to my next business class. And then set is kind of my last availability to set up on the top, and that's really my defined set within the system. So if I wanted it by, an employee's name, or if I wanted it by, let's say, the department that they're in, or if I wanted to order this, it's really where set comes into play. There are some more intricacies related around set, depending on how deep you go into, what module, which object, and which action you get. But most of the stuff you do, that really is a help definition of kind of how do I put this together. So we then now move into kind of the bottom half of the screen, or the bottom 2/3. Our key fields are fields that need to be dealt with. They are mandatory. So for anyone who's kind of dealt with a database, these are our primary keys. So these are the way that I work through and identify the information that I'm going to get, the data that I'm going to get, and what data do I get. So the key fields always have to be selected. So I grab those, I highlight them, and I move them over to my selected fields, which we'll talk more about in a second. My non-key fields, so this is everything else. So this is all of the other information that's on my employee business class that I can see or get access to, that the builder is pulling from. So my non-key fields, it's a huge list that you can get through, and you'll notice within here we have some that don't look normal. So we talked earlier about my accessibility to my config console field. So if I create a field and that is data that I need because it's either derived or it's a new piece of information, it's built right into the system. It's baked in that I can grab that if it's on the business class that I've selected. Here you'll see that we have a few fields that were built. These are ones that were gone in the config console, went to the employee business class. We created these, we defined them and said what they are to be done, and now I can pull them in. And when I select them, it goes over to my selected fields and values panel. This is all of the information that I want to then pull over. You'll notice at the top we have our HR organization and our employee, and you'll notice that here on this screenshot, I've actually tied a variable to those. So for the HR org that I pass in and the employee that I pass in, I want to get all of the other information related to those those people, because I'm then taking my variables that I have controlled and sent it into the builder. We then select all of the fields that we want, and there may be instances, which happens on a regular basis, where I need to define, so earlier I said if I wanted everyone within a single department. My department isn't a key field, so it's not as simple as just putting a variable in the department field. I have to handle that slightly different. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Kind of tying into this, we wanted to call out that you'll notice I have an XREF mapping field. So back to the accessibility, I can actually access my cross-reference. So my ability to map data, the built-in functionality that Infor provides is called the cross-reference. I can get to that via IPA. It's still accessible, and we're not going to deep dive into that now, but we're definitely going to have that in a future presentation. So my way to be able to filter on non-key fields is called a filter string. You'll notice in the middle of the screen, we have the filter string. So I can then take any of my key fields as well as my non-key fields and build out a definition string to say, who should I be gathering? So it's a way to then get and define my list of data based off of a non-key field. And then you heard me talk a bit about page size earlier. So this is my way of controlling how many records at a time that I'm gathering.
And I think this is a question I've got about this one really quick, since we've talked about it a couple times. Can you give any guidance on how we would determine page size? So here it's 30, and maybe in my mind that makes sense for doing some complex work on some employees, but do you have any rule of thumb for how you adjust this up or down based on what kind of data you're dealing with?
Yeah, so I generally, if I'm not doing, I'll put the word crazy amount of processing. The more processing that you're doing within your loop, I would probably move this down some. I mean, the biggest piece, I guess, what I would key on this is how much data storage you're using. So the number of records I pull has an effect to the amount of data storage that I'm saving. The larger the data storage that I'm holding on to, much slower processing I'm going to have. So if I have a huge amount of processing that I'm doing, I'll tend to move this down a little bit, and depending on how many records I need to process. But I would say 75% of the time, I'm leaving this the default 30.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, we saw how this is all kind of built out using that builder, but this is what it ends up looking like. So, again, we've got some really powerful tools, but when we break it all down, this is relatively straightforward stuff. And so you can see as we look through what's in this transaction string here, you can see how all of these different variables and objects that we pulled in through the builder kind of come into play here. We see our data area. We see the module that we looked for, the business class. We see the different fields that we wanted to pull in. And this is where that transaction import comes into play a little bit, and we're kind of sharing some of these strings comes in. And if you're used to Lawson S3 process flow, you're probably familiar with what this looks like a little bit. This is a little bit different than an AGS or a DME call, but it's the same vein. It's certainly pretty familiar if you are used to designing calls that way. And this just kind of gives you a real quick look. If you're looking at a really complex flow, you don't have to go into the builder and load that thing every time to see what's being pulled in. You can just look at this transaction string and kind of mentally parse out, all right, what's being pulled in here? What do the filter look like? How is this thing being built? What are the variables being used here? It's kind of an easy way to get that 30,000 foot look at what that transaction node's going to be doing.
And then kind of calling out the editing real quick on that, Jared. So, and to that point, if I identify a field, I don't necessarily, if I know what the field is, I don't necessarily have to go back into the build, go find the variable attached in there and click OK to go through that. You can edit it right here. So you have the ability to edit this transaction string straight from the properties pane in and of itself. You're going to follow the same syntax. If you know the way that it needs to look, you can put it in there. Don't feel like you have to, but if you know what you need to add in there, it's a simple one field you want to add to the end. Feel free to just do your ampersand and your field name. As long as it's built on that business class, you're going to be able to get it. So you can edit straight from here. When you learn how to utilize these, you learn what the syntax looks like. Sometimes it's just a little bit easier to go in and make strict edits to it.
Yep. Good point.
Yeah.
And that's it. That kind of wraps up what we wanted to go through. So I know we ran a little bit long, but it's not quite the top of the hour yet. So I do want to open the floor up for a couple questions if anybody has any.
Nothing in the, oh, hold on, Kelly, I missed the first, I'll answer that one. But other than that, there's nothing in the chat at this moment, gentlemen.
Okay.
All right. Well, with that, then, Dave or Brian, I'll hand it back to you here for the final slide.
All right. Thanks, guys. Great session.
Good presentation.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This is the last webinar for our October series. So we hope you enjoyed the month of October and gaining information from the team at Bales. We look forward to delivering additional webinar series in the upcoming months. Please, again, look for notifications on social media, our website, and Digital Concourse for the future upcoming webinars. As a closing thought, we wanted to make you aware of our Coffee with Consultants offering. If you have any questions about what you saw today or any questions related to the Infor products, please reach out to us via our website. We'll connect you with a consultant who will spend a half an hour with you at no charge over coffee and tea or whatever your beverage of choice is, and answer any questions related to your Infor system. Again, half an hour with a Bales consultant to ask anything you want at no charge. Again, thank you again for attending, and we look forward to future webinars. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.